James Carter, the billionaire CEO of Carter Enterprises, stood by the window of his high-rise office, staring at the sprawling city below. His company was a titan in the business world, boasting thousands of employees across various industries. Yet despite its success, he had begun hearing unsettling reports. Rumors of employees mistreating their colleagues, showing favoritism, and fostering a toxic workplace culture. James had built his empire from the ground up, once struggling as a young entrepreneur, with barely enough money to keep his dreams alive. He valued hard work and integrity, but he feared that these principles were being lost within his own company. Determined to see the truth for himself, James devised a daring plan. He would go undercover as a new, struggling employee. Stripped of his wealth, his status, and his power, he would walk among his employees not as their CEO, but as an unknown, desperate worker just trying to make ends meet. With the help of a trusted friend, James underwent a complete transformation. His tailored suits were replaced with second-hand clothes, his expensive watch was left behind, and his neatly trimmed hair was allowed to grow out into an unkempt mess. A fake identity was created. John Harris, an out-of-work man who had lost everything and was desperate for a fresh start. Armed with a fabricated backstory, James applied for an entry-level job in one of his own company's warehouse facilities. He wanted to experience the workplace from the ground level to see how his employees treated those they perceived as unimportant. After a brief, indifferent interview, he was hired as a janitor. The pay was minimum wage, the hours long, and the work exhausting. But James was ready for the challenge. James arrived at the warehouse early in the morning, dressed in a worn-out hoodie and faded jeans. The air smelled of oil and cardboard, and the sound of forklifts moving heavy pallets filled the massive space. He was introduced to his supervisor, Rick, a burly man in his 40s with a permanent scowl on his face. Rick barely glanced at James before shoving a mop into his hands. "Floor's a mess. Clean it up. And don't slack off or you're out," Rick barked before walking away. James got to work, silently observing the people around him. Some employees barely noticed him, treating him like he was invisible. Others smirked at him, whispering among themselves about how pathetic he looked. A few, however, gave him nods of acknowledgement or small smiles, glimpses of kindness in an otherwise cold environment. As the day dragged on, James witnessed firsthand the workplace dynamics. There were cliques that excluded others, supervisors who talked down to workers, and employees who looked out only for themselves. But there were also genuine, hardworking people who did their best despite the negativity around them. One person stood out, a young woman named Emily, who worked tirelessly stacking boxes. Unlike the others, she treated James with respect, offering him a bottle of water during his break. "You're new here, right?" she asked, sitting beside him on a wooden crate. James nodded. "Yeah, first day." "It gets easier," she said with a small smile. "Just don't let them get to you." James appreciated her kindness, but he knew this was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, he would see who truly lived by the values he once held dear, and who only cared about power and appearances. And when the time came, the truth would be revealed. The air inside Orion Electronics' warehouse was thick with the scent of oil, metal, and sweat. Adam Walker, now known as Daniel Reed, the newest temp worker, struggled to keep up as he stacked boxes onto a conveyor belt. His muscles ached from the labor, a stark contrast to the corporate boardrooms he was accustomed to. But this was exactly what he needed, a first-hand glimpse into the struggles his employees faced. The morning rush had been relentless. Adam observed his co-workers, some of them efficient, others sluggish but determined. Then there was Miguel, a wiry man with calloused hands who worked with robotic precision despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "Keep up, newbie," Miguel teased, smirking as he lifted a crate with ease. Adam forced a grin. "You make it look easy," Miguel chuckled. "You get used to it, or you don't last." A few stations down, a middle-aged woman named Karen winced as she adjusted her back, but she didn't complain. A single mother working double shifts to provide for her kids. Adam had read her file before coming here, but seeing her pain firsthand struck a chord. The warehouse supervisor, Don Briggs, was a towering figure with a sharp gaze. It didn't take long for Adam to notice the fear he instilled in the workers. He barked orders, often with a hint of condescension, and had no patience for mistakes. "Hey, Reed, this isn't nap time," Don's voice boomed as he caught Adam hesitating. Adam swallowed his pride and nodded. Yes, sir, Don sneered. Better pick up the pace, or you won't last the week. The way Don wielded his authority unsettled Adam. He had always envisioned Orion as a company that valued its employees. Was this the reality beneath the polished corporate reports? During lunch, Adam sat with Miguel, Karen, and a few others. Their conversation gave him insight he never expected. We used to have more people on shifts, Karen said, rubbing her sore wrists. But after the last layoffs, we're doing twice the work for the same pay. Miguel nodded. And Don? He's been riding us harder than ever. If you speak up, you're out. Can't HR do anything? Adam asked, feigning ignorance. Karen scoffed. HER. They're more worried about pleasing corporate than helping us. A lump formed in Adam's throat. He had no idea how deep these issues ran. That evening, Adam saw Don berating a younger worker, Jake, for not meeting quotas. The kid was barely out of high school, and Adam could see the frustration in his eyes. Maybe if you stopped yapping and moved faster, we wouldn't be behind, Don growled. Adam clenched his fist but took a deep breath. Confronting Don outright wasn't an option. He'd blow his cover, but he could help Jake in his own way. As Don stormed off, Adam approached Jake. Hey, I'll help you catch up. Jake looked surprised. You don't have to, Adam smiled. We're all in this together, right? As they worked side by side, a sense of camaraderie formed, something Adam hadn't felt in years. That night, Adam lay on his cot in a modest apartment he had rented for the experiment, reflecting on everything he had witnessed. The long hours, the physical strain, the oppressive management. His employees weren't just numbers on a report. They were people struggling to survive. He had come here to learn. What he found was something far more important, a mission. This wasn't just about Orion's reputation anymore. It was about fixing the very foundation of his company. Ethan sat in the cramped break room, a plastic coffee cup in his hand, listening intently as a group of employees vented about their frustrations. He had spent a week as Chris, the unassuming new hire, and the deeper he dug, the more he realized how disconnected he had been as CEO. Management keeps pushing for higher sales numbers, but they don't give us the tools to succeed, grumbled Lisa, a senior sales associate. Yeah, and every time we bring up concerns, it's like talking to a wall, added Jason, an operations assistant. They act like we don't exist. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had always prided himself on running an employee-friendly company, but clearly the reality was different. The sales team was under immense pressure, warehouse staff felt overworked, and customer service reps were expected to handle unrealistic quotas. That evening, Ethan reviewed his hidden camera footage. He had documented every conversation, every struggle his employees faced. The evidence was damning. His senior management team had built a barrier between him and the real problems of the company. Determined to get a fuller picture, he decided to work an overnight shift at one of the warehouses. The next night, dressed in his dusty uniform, he lifted heavy boxes and stacked shelves alongside warehouse workers who had no idea they were sweating next to their CEO. How long you been here, Chris? Asked Marcus, a seasoned warehouse worker, as they hauled a pallet into place. Just a few weeks, Ethan responded, wiping sweat from his brow. How about you? 6 years. Not that it matters. Management doesn't even know we exist. Marcus laughed bitterly. They just keep cutting hours and expecting us to work miracles. Ethan frowned. What do you mean, cutting hours? Marcus shook his head. Overtime used to be standard, but now they say it costs too much. So instead, we're understaffed, and we have to rush orders just to keep up. Mistakes happen. People get hurt. And when we complain, they say we should be grateful to have jobs. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had never authorized such drastic cuts. Who was making these decisions behind his back? The next morning back at headquarters, Ethan, still disguised as Chris, was called into the regional manager's office. Chris, I've been watching you closely, said Anthony Caldwell, the regional manager. I like your work ethic. Maybe you'd like to take on some extra responsibilities. We could use people like you in leadership. Ethan hid his surprise. What kind of responsibilities? Anthony leaned back in his chair, smirking. Let's just say, helping enforce company policies. Not all employees understand how things work. We need people who do. Ethan narrowed his eyes. And what if these policies hurt employees? Anthony's smirk faded. You want to move up, or do you want to keep lifting boxes? Ethan had his answer. His management team had created a toxic culture of fear and exploitation. Now he needed to figure out how deep the corruption ran and how to take them down without revealing who he was too soon. James Carter had spent the past weeks infiltrating Carter Tech's lower ranks under the alias of Ben Walker. What he had uncovered so far was both enlightening and alarming. While he found a deep well of talent and dedication among his employees, he had also stumbled upon a disturbing pattern of unethical behavior at the managerial level. One name kept surfacing: Richard Coleman, the regional manager of operations. James had initially dismissed the scattered complaints against Coleman as mere workplace gossip. But after hearing firsthand accounts from several employees about mismanagement, intimidation, and even financial discrepancies, he knew he had to investigate further. With the help of Melissa, an accountant who had been discreetly assisting him, James arranged to meet with a warehouse supervisor, Carl Jennings. Carl had been hesitant at first, but finally agreed to speak in private after work hours. The two met at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Carl's hands trembled slightly as he stirred his coffee. "You don't understand," he said in a low voice. "People who speak up against Coleman don't last here. He makes sure of that." James leaned forward. "I need to know the truth, Carl. What exactly is he doing?" Carl took a deep breath. "It's not just the way he treats people. He's been skimming money from the company, inflating costs, manipulating supplier invoices, and pocketing the difference. He's got a few supervisors on his payroll who keep quiet and cover his tracks." James clenched his jaw. If Carl's allegations were true, not only was Coleman a toxic leader, but he was also committing fraud against the company. Determined to gather irrefutable proof, James and Melissa devised a plan. Melissa had access to financial records and found patterns of suspicious transactions. Meanwhile, James arranged to be near Coleman's office late one evening when he knew some business was being conducted. Hiding in a storage area near the office, James managed to record a conversation between Coleman and a supplier. What he heard made his blood boil. "Just adjust the numbers like last time." Coleman's voice was calm but commanding. "We split the extra and nobody's the wiser." That was the proof he needed. James returned home that night with a sense of purpose. He was no longer just gathering insight. He was about to go to war for his company and employees. He called an emergency board meeting for the following morning, making sure Coleman would be there. The game was about to change. Ethan had never felt more conflicted. His days at Haven Tech were once spent in the luxury of a CEO's office. But now, under the guise of Ethan Carter, a mere IT technician, he was knee-deep in the struggles of the very employees he once thought he understood. With each passing day, the corruption and exploitation became clearer, and the more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. One morning, Ethan logged into his assigned workstation, only to find an encrypted email waiting for him. The sender was anonymous, and the subject line read, "Look deeper." His pulse quickened as he clicked on the attachment, a series of financial records and transaction logs detailing misallocated funds and suspicious payments to offshore accounts. Someone inside Haven Tech knew what was happening and was trying to expose it. But why send it to him? And more importantly, who else knew? As Ethan tried to make sense of the data, his screen suddenly went black, and a single line of text appeared. "They are watching." A moment later, his system rebooted as if nothing had happened. A cold chill ran down his spine. Later that day, Zoe, the sharp and fearless marketing assistant, stormed into the break room, her face flushed with frustration. "They shut down my report," she seethed, slamming her laptop onto the table. "I had proof that the company was fabricating client success rates. They wiped it from the system before I could present it. And now the head of PR wants to have a talk with me." Ethan glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "Zoe, you need to be careful. Whoever is behind this isn't just covering up a few bad numbers. This is bigger." She narrowed her eyes. "And how do you know that?" He hesitated before deciding to trust her. "Because I just got an anonymous leak of internal financial data. Someone is stealing from the company, and they're covering their tracks." Her expression shifted from anger to determination. Then we find out who and expose them, together. Meanwhile, in the upper floors of Haven Tech, Grant Morrison, the ruthless COO, sat across from a shadowy figure in his office. "The mole is getting too close," the figure said. "We need to take action before they unravel everything." Morrison smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Then let's set a trap. We'll make them think they're one step ahead, right before we take them out of the game." The next day, Ethan received an unexpected message from Morrison himself. "Meet me in my office at 8 p.m. I have a proposition for you." His cover was at risk, but he had no choice. He had to walk into the lion's den. As James continued his undercover journey, the pressure mounted. His experiences in the past weeks had been enlightening, but also frustrating. The stark contrast between his corporate decisions and their real-world impact weighed heavily on him. He had seen loyal employees struggling under policies he once thought were beneficial. Now he understood their struggles firsthand. One evening, after another exhausting shift, James sat alone in the break room, reflecting on his journey. He had witnessed dedication, sacrifice, and, most importantly, a desire for change. But the real challenge lay ahead. How could he, as CEO, initiate meaningful transformation without exposing his secret prematurely? His disguise had allowed him to experience the company's operations from the ground level. Now it was time to push further. He decided to test his manager's leadership skills. Over the next few days, he observed closely, noting who truly cared about their employees and who merely enforced policies without question. One night, James overheard a conversation between two managers, Linda and Greg. Linda, a dedicated leader, expressed her frustration with the system, advocating for better employee benefits and working conditions. Greg, however, dismissed her concerns. "It's not our problem, Linda. The executives make the rules. We just follow them. If the employees don't like it, they can leave." James clenched his fists. This mindset had festered within his company, and he had been blind to it. This was the very reason morale had plummeted. Determined to test Greg's resolve, James approached him the next day, still in his disguise. "Sir, I heard you talking last night. Do you really think employees should just leave if they're unhappy?" James asked cautiously. Greg scoffed. "Of course, this is a business, not a charity. If they want better treatment, they need to work harder." James felt a surge of anger but kept his composure. This was the turning point. He had seen enough. James spent the next few days gathering evidence, talking to employees, and making careful notes. It was time to address the board, but he needed a strategy. A sudden revelation of his true identity could cause chaos. Instead, he devised a plan, a company-wide evaluation based on employee feedback. He created an anonymous survey asking employees to rate their satisfaction and suggest changes. He ensured that every worker had a chance to participate. What he received in return was both heartbreaking and motivating. The responses painted a picture of an overworked, undervalued workforce. But they also showed hope. Employees wanted change, and they believed it was possible. James decided to implement a secret test. He introduced a challenge to the managers: improve employee satisfaction in their teams over the next month, with a significant reward for those who succeeded. However, he knew Greg and those like him would resist, exposing their true nature. As the test began, Linda and a few others embraced the challenge, implementing small but meaningful changes. Greg, on the other hand, remained indifferent. Employees under his management continued to suffer, and James took careful notes. The results of the challenge would determine the fate of many in the company. James now had everything he needed to make a decision. The breaking point had arrived, and soon the entire company would witness a shift unlike anything before. He was ready to reveal the truth. The atmosphere inside the company's headquarters had shifted dramatically. After weeks of working undercover, Daniel had seen the raw truth behind his own corporation. Both the inspiring dedication of the hardworking employees and the festering corruption that threatened to destroy everything he had built. With each new revelation, the weight on his shoulders grew heavier, and now he was at a crossroads. Daniel sat in his modest apartment, far removed from the luxury of his executive suite. His disguise as Michael had become more than just a mask. It had become a second identity, a perspective he could never ignore. He knew he couldn't simply return to his CEO position. and pretend nothing had happened. But exposing the rot within his company would come at a cost, and he had to be prepared for the consequences. Determined to take action, Daniel arranged a secret meeting with Emma, the senior manager who had been fighting against the unethical practices in the company. He reached out to her anonymously, instructing her to meet him at a quiet diner away from prying eyes. Emma arrived cautiously, her expression wary but resolute. She had been investigating the suspicious activities of certain high-ranking executives and had compiled a dossier of evidence. When she saw Daniel waiting for her, she hesitated, recognizing him immediately despite his disguise. "Michael," she asked, confused. Daniel exhaled and pulled off his glasses. "Not exactly. My real name is Daniel Grant." Emma's eyes widened in shock. "The CEO? This whole time?" He nodded. "I needed to see the truth for myself, and now I need your help to take down the corruption before it destroys everything." Emma's expression hardened. "Then you'd better see this." She slid the folder across the table. Inside was a detailed account of financial fraud, labor exploitation, and internal bribery, all orchestrated by Charles Whitmore, the company's CFO. Charles had been siphoning funds, manipulating contracts, and silencing whistleblowers to maintain his grip on power. "This is worse than I imagined," Daniel muttered. "How deep does it go?" Emma leaned in, lowering her voice. "Deep enough that if you go public without a solid plan, they'll bury you before you can act." Before Daniel could strategize his next move, the company was hit with a scandal. An anonymous leak exposed some of the corruption within the company, but the report had been manipulated. Instead of implicating Charles, the documents pointed to Daniel himself. The media erupted, painting him as an out-of-touch CEO who had allowed these crimes to flourish under his leadership. At that moment, Daniel realized Charles had been one step ahead. The CFO had caught wind of his investigation and decided to strike first, framing Daniel to divert attention from himself. With the board turning against him and the company's reputation in free fall, Daniel was officially suspended from his position pending an internal review. The betrayal cut deep. He had spent his life building this company, and now he was being ousted by the very people who had been poisoning it from within. But he wasn't about to give up. As Daniel left the office, escorted by security, he glanced at Emma, who gave him a determined nod. They weren't finished yet. "If they want a war," Daniel murmured under his breath, "I'll give them one." With his CEO title stripped and his name dragged through the mud, Daniel was now an outsider to his own company. But that only meant he could fight without restrictions. The gloves were off. It was time to take the company back. Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him. His time undercover had given him a deep understanding of his company's faults and strengths. But more than that, it had shown him the people who truly made Stratus Industries what it was. He had formed bonds with workers who had no idea they were speaking to their CEO. And now, with his true identity on the verge of being revealed, he knew he had to make things right. Meanwhile, in the warehouse, Jordan sensed that something was off. The rumors about Ethan's real identity were spreading rapidly. Some employees brushed it off as nonsense, while others started putting the pieces together. Jordan had his suspicions from the start. Ethan's questions, his curiosity about operations, and his reaction to certain situations, it all made sense now. "We need to talk," Jordan said as he approached Ethan near the break room. His voice was low, cautious. Ethan nodded. "Let's take a walk." They stepped outside into the cool night air. Ethan exhaled deeply. "I have a feeling you already know what I'm about to say." Jordan crossed his arms. "I have my guesses, but I need to hear it from you." Ethan met his gaze. "I'm Ethan Carter, Chief Executive Officer of Stratus Industries." A tense silence followed. Jordan's expression hardened, but there was no immediate anger, just contemplation. "So everything you told us, was that real? Or just part of the act?" Jordan's voice carried the weight of betrayal. Ethan stepped forward. "It was real. Every conversation, every moment I spent working beside you, it wasn't an act. I needed to see for myself what was happening inside my own company. And what I found, it changed everything." Jordan ran a hand through his hair. "Damn, so what now? You just go back to your fancy office and forget about us?" Ethan shook his head. "I plan to fix things. For real, I've already started making changes, but I need your help. You know this place better than I do. I need people who understand the heart of this company." Jordan studied him, his expression unreadable. "You really mean that?" "I do. I'm done being the CEO who only looks at numbers. It's time I start looking at the people who make this company run." Jordan sighed, then smirked. "Well, you've certainly got guts, I'll give you that." But not everyone was as willing to listen. Inside the warehouse, news of Ethan's real identity had reached Claire, the hard-working single mother who had confided in Ethan about her struggles. She felt betrayed. How could he listen to her problems, pretend to be one of them, and yet still be the person at the top who allowed these issues to exist in the first place? The next day, Ethan stood before the entire warehouse team, ready to address them all. Murmurs filled the air as the employees gathered, their eyes filled with curiosity, frustration, and skepticism. Ethan took a deep breath. "I know many of you feel betrayed. I won't stand here and ask for your forgiveness right away. But what I will ask is for your trust in what comes next. I went undercover because I needed to see the truth for myself. And what I saw, I promise you, it won't be ignored." Claire stepped forward. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" "Talk is cheap, Mr. CEO." Ethan nodded. "You're right, so let me show you. Starting today, real changes begin." He unveiled a list of initiatives: wage increases, better working conditions, employee support programs, and most importantly, a restructuring of management to ensure the workers had a voice in company decisions. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Jordan glanced at Claire, then back at Ethan. "Guess we'll see if you can keep that promise." Ethan nodded. "You will." As the employees processed the bombshell, Ethan knew one thing: the real challenge was only just beginning. Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him like a boulder. His mission as an undercover CEO had taken unexpected turns. What began as a simple attempt to understand his company from the ground up had become an entangled mess of corporate corruption, personal betrayals, and a newfound sense of responsibility toward the people who work for him. As he sifted through the documents Grace had handed him, the evidence of embezzlement and fraud within the company was undeniable. Large sums of money had been funneled into offshore accounts, contracts had been manipulated, and key personnel had been receiving bribes to look the other way. And at the heart of it all was Daniel Reed, his most trusted executive. Ethan clenched his fists. Daniel had been with the company for over a decade, helping to build it from the ground up. The idea that he could betray everything they stood for was almost incomprehensible. Almost. Grace entered the office quietly, her face grim. "Ethan, we need to act fast. If Daniel catches wind of this, he'll cover his tracks and disappear before we can stop him." Ethan nodded. "We need concrete proof, something that will hold up in court, something that will bring him down." Grace hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I have a lead. There's an encrypted server hidden within the company's network. If we can access it, we might find the final piece of the puzzle." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Then let's do it." Late that night, Ethan and Grace met in the IT department with Julian, one of the company's top cybersecurity experts. Julian was nervous but determined. He had suspected something was off for months, but never had the means to prove it. "The server is locked behind multiple layers of encryption," Julian explained as he typed furiously on his laptop. "Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing, but I can crack it. Just give me time." Minutes turned into hours as Julian worked through the layers of security. Every so often, he muttered under his breath, cursing the complexity of the system. Then finally, he let out a triumphant chuckle. "We're in!" Ethan and Grace leaned in as Julian scrolled through the data. What they found was worse than they had imagined. Detailed records of illicit transactions, forged documents, and names of every executive involved in the scheme, including Daniel Reed. "This is it," Grace whispered. "This is enough to bring them down." But just as Julian prepared to transfer the data to a secure drive, the screen went black. The power in the building flickered, then died completely. A moment later, the emergency lights clicked on, casting an eerie glow over the office. "Damn it," Julian cursed. "They know we're in. Someone triggered a failsafe. Ethan's phone buzzed. A single message from an unknown number. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ethan. Walk away while you still can." His jaw tightened. "Number, we finish this." The next morning, Ethan stormed into Daniel's office, the incriminating documents in hand. Daniel was sitting behind his desk, calm as ever, sipping his coffee. "Ethan," he said with a smirk, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" Ethan threw the folder onto the desk. "Cut the act, Daniel. I know everything. The fraud, the offshore accounts, the bribes. It's over." Daniel sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You always were too idealistic, Ethan. Did you really think a company this big could run without a little maneuvering? Maneuvering? You stole from the people who trusted you. You risked everything we built." Daniel chuckled, his demeanor unnervingly relaxed. "And yet, here I am, still in power. Do you really think you can bring me down?" Ethan stepped closer. "I don't think, I know. I have the evidence and I'm taking it to the authorities." Daniel's smirk faded. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. Walk away and I can make sure you come out of this unscathed. Fight me and you won't just lose your company, you'll lose everything." Ethan met his gaze unwavering. "I'd rather lose everything than let you get away with this." Daniel exhaled slowly, then pressed a button on his desk. Security guards entered the room. "Take him out," Daniel ordered. "Make sure he doesn't come back." The guards moved toward Ethan. He had expected this, but he wasn't alone. As the door burst open, Grace and Julian stormed in, flanked by 2 federal agents. "Stand down," one of the agents commanded. "Daniel Reed, you're under arrest." Daniel's face twisted in fury. "You set me up." Ethan shook his head. "No, Daniel. You did this to yourself." As the agents cuffed Daniel and escorted him out, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. But the fight for the company's future was just beginning. The grand unveiling was set. A company-wide town hall meeting had been announced, and every employee, from warehouse workers to top executives, was expected to attend. The air was thick with anticipation, rumors flying about what the big announcement could be. As the clock struck noon, the lights dimmed and a spotlight shone on the stage. Mark Winston, still in his disguise, walked up. The employees murmured, some recognizing him as Daniel, the hard-working new recruit who had been in the trenches with them. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Mark removed his disguise. Gasps filled the air. The CEO of Winston Enterprises stood before them, the same man they had worked alongside for the past few months. "I know many of you are shocked," Mark began, his voice steady. "For the past few months, I have lived as one of you. I have seen your struggles, your triumphs, and most importantly, the true heart of this company." The room was silent, eyes wide with disbelief. "I did this because I needed to understand what was happening beyond the walls of my office. I wanted to know what it truly means to work at Winston Enterprises, and what I found was both inspiring and concerning." He took a deep breath, letting his words settle. "First, let me say that I have never been prouder to lead this company. The dedication and passion I have witnessed are beyond anything I could have imagined. But I have also seen inefficiencies, unfair policies, and struggles that should never have existed in a company that prides itself on excellence. And that is why I stand here today." The screen behind him lit up, displaying a list of initiatives. 1. Fair wages for all. Wage disparities would be addressed immediately, ensuring every employee received fair compensation for their work. 2. Better work conditions. Warehouse conditions would be improved, with safer equipment and better schedules to avoid burnout. 3. Employee support programs, new healthcare and mental wellness programs would be introduced. 4. Direct CEO communication line. Employees would have a way to report concerns directly to leadership, eliminating unnecessary bureaucracy. 5. Leadership restructuring. Certain executives who had been dismissive of employees' needs would be replaced with leaders who truly cared. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Mark smiled, but he wasn't finished. "These changes are just the beginning, and I want each and every one of you to know, you matter. You are the reason this company thrives." Tears welled up in some eyes while others stood in a stunned silence, processing the weight of his words. Employees who had felt invisible for years now felt seen. Those who had believed their complaints would never be heard now had hope. As the meeting ended, employees swarmed Mark, shaking his hand, thanking him, and sharing their stories. He listened, truly listened, knowing that his mission was far from over. This wasn't just about running a company, it was about creating a legacy where people, not just profits, were at the center. As Mark left the stage, he knew he had accomplished what he set out to do. Winston Enterprises would never be the same again, and neither would he.